Tonight a caliph whispers, "Bring me my brother's head," and the only answer is steel biting through perfume and bone. This is how Al-Khaafidh repays men who build palaces higher than heaven. In the year 799, the city of peace was anything but peaceful. It was a throbbing, glittering beast of a metropolis that consumed the souls of men and spat them out in diamonds. To walk the streets of Baghdad under the Abbasid moon was to breathe an air so thick with the smoke of burning ambergris and the rot of excessive indulgence that it coated the back of your throat like a layer of sweet poison. But high above the mud brick hovels of the common wretches, in the marble halls where the air was cooled by fountains flowing with rosewater, sat a man who had forgotten he was made of clay. Ja'far al-Barmaki was not merely a grand vizier, he was a phenomenon, a celestial body that had descended to earth to teach the Caliph Harun al-Rashid the true meaning of splendor, or so he believed in the quiet, arrogant chambers of his heart. The Barmakid dynasty had woven themselves into the very tendons of the empire, their fingers deep in every coffer, their spies in every shadow, and their names chanted in the bazaars louder than the call to prayer. Ja'far moved through this world of impossible luxury with a languid, terrifying grace, draped in tunics of Tyrian purple and silk spun so fine they whispered against his skin like a lover's breath. He possessed a beauty that was unsettling, a perfection of face and form that drew men and women alike into his orbit, only to burn them with the cold fire of his indifference. At his nightly gatherings, the wine flowed not from jars but from the mouths of golden lions, and the poets did not sing of God or the Prophet, but of the glory of Ja'far, comparing his generosity to the Tigris and his wrath to the desert sun. He sat upon a throne that rivaled the Caliph's own, resting his feet on cushions stuffed with the down of rare birds, utterly drunk on the most dangerous vintage of all, the absolute certainty of his own invincibility. He looked out over the sprawling empire, from the sands of Africa to the snows of the east, and saw only a mirror reflecting his own magnificence, blind to the fact that he was standing on the edge of a precipice carved by his own vanity. The courtiers fawned and scraped, their foreheads touching the mosaic floors in displays of obsequious terror, for they knew that a raised eyebrow from Ja'far could end a lineage faster than a plague. Yet, amidst the clinking of silver goblets and the hypnotic swirl of the dancing girls, there was a heavy, unspoken tension, a vibration in the floorboards that hinted at something shifting deep within the earth. It was the low, rumbling growl of Al-Khaafidh, the abaser, the divine name that lowers the proud to the dust, slowly waking from its slumber to gaze upon this peacock strutting before the storm. Ja'far had built a tower of hubris that pierced the clouds, unaware that the higher the construction, the more unstable the foundation, and the very ground beneath his jeweled sandals was already turning to quicksand. He laughed, a sound like breaking crystal, tossing handfuls of pure gold dinars to the musicians as if they were pebbles, while outside the palace walls, the wind picked up, carrying the first grain of sand that would bury him. It was a poison administered in drops of honey, a slow and sickly sweet intoxication that convinced Ja'far al-Barmaki that the sun rose and set at his command, and it was this precise delusion that began to rot the very foundations of the Abbasid throne. The tragedy was not born of hatred, but of a love that had festered into a grotesque mockery of brotherhood. For years, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid and his vizier had been as one soul in two bodies, wearing each other's robes, sharing the same horse, and drinking from the same cup until the lines between master and servant had blurred into a dangerous grey fog. But where Harun saw a beloved companion, Ja'far began to see a puppet, a golden idol to be managed, placated, and ultimately sidelined while the Barmakids carved up the empire like a roasted lamb. The transformation was insidious, manifesting first in the coffers of the state, where Ja'far stood as the iron gatekeeper, clutching the keys to the treasury with a grip so tight it strangled the Caliph's own desires. When the commander of the faithful, the shadow of God on earth, would ask for a mere few thousand dinars to bestow upon a poet or to fund a pilgrimage, Ja'far would furrow his brow with the exaggerated concern of a parent denying a child a sweetmeat, lecturing the ruler of the Muslim world on the virtues of thrift while he himself poured millions into the construction of pleasure domes that defied the laws of nature. He built a palace on the eastern bank of the Tigris that was not a residence but a declaration of war against humility, a sprawling complex of 20 million dirhams where the walls were inlaid with teak and ivory and the floors were paved with marble brought from the quarries of the ancients. It was a visual blasphemy that screamed of ambition, a structure so towering and magnificent that when the Caliph looked out from his own balcony, his view was obstructed by the gleaming white stone of his servant's vanity. Harun would stand there, gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white, forcing a smile while the cold worm of jealousy began to eat a hole in his gut, watching the dignitaries and the foreign emissaries flock to Ja'far's gate before they even deigned to visit the palace of the Caliph. The Barmakid court became the true center of gravity in Baghdad, a place where the petitioners lined up for miles, clutching their requests, knowing that a nod from Ja'far was worth more than a decree signed by Harun himself. The vizier had grown so comfortable in his borrowed power that he began to treat the Caliph's presence as a tiresome formality, speaking over him in council, dismissing his suggestions with a wave of a perfumed hand, and making decisions that shifted the fate of nations without so much as a whisper of consultation. There was a sickening arrogance in the way Ja'far walked, a swagger that said he believed himself to be the intellect behind the brute force, the true architect of the Golden Age, reducing the Caliph to a mere figurehead suitable only for prayer and procreation. He surrounded himself with sycophants who whispered that the Barmakids were the true pillars of the realm, that without them, the Abbasid dynasty would collapse into dust, and Ja'far, drunk on the wine of his own ego, believed every word. He forgot the terrified whispers of the ancients who warned that the favor of kings is like riding a lion, you may feel powerful for a moment, but you are always just one slip away from being devoured. The tension in the air grew thick and humid, like the atmosphere before a breaking storm, as the Caliph's patience was eroded grain by grain, stripped away by 1,000 petty humiliations, the denied funds, the overshadowed processions, the whispers in the bazaar that Harun was merely Ja'far's Caliph. Even the servant's father, the wise old Yahya, sensed the gathering darkness, warning his son that he was flying too close to the sun on wings made of wax, but Ja'far only laughed, his eyes bright with the fever of hubris, unable to see the shadow of the executioner lengthening across his beautiful, doomed neck. He had committed the ultimate sin in the court of absolute power, he had made himself indispensable in his own mind while making himself intolerable in the eyes of his master. The intricate web of patronage he had spun, intended to secure his safety, was slowly tightening into a noose, and the silence of the Caliph was not the silence of contentment, but the predator's stillness before the lunge. Every brick of silver he laid in his garden, every poet he bribed to sing his praises, every moment he kept the Caliph waiting was a vibration on the web that alerted the spider, and deep in the recesses of the royal palace, the name Al-Khaafidh began to resonate, a low-frequency hum that signaled the coming inversion, the turning of the wheel that would grind the highest star into the lowest mud. The change did not arrive with the crashing of cymbals or the blaring of trumpets, but rather like a creeping miasma rising from the stagnant marshes of the Tigris, a slow and suffocating fog that began to choke the life out of the court of Baghdad. It was in the year 802 that the invisible scales of the divine finally tipped, and the weight of Al-Khaafidh, the abaser, pressed down upon the city of peace with a gravity that could be felt in the very marrow of one's bones. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the man whose word was law from the Indus to the Atlantic, had ceased to be a brother to Ja'far al-Barmaki and had become something infinitely more terrifying, he became a quiet observer. The warmth that had once radiated from the Caliph's eyes, that easy, affectionate camaraderie that had allowed them to share secrets and cloaks, had hardened into discs of obsidian, cold and unyielding, reflecting nothing but the terrifying calculation of a predator watching a particularly fat gazelle graze in ignorance. The court, that great hive of gossip and malice, sensed the shift long before the vizier did, for the survival instinct of a sycophant is sharper than the finest Damascus steel. Men who had once thrown themselves into the mud just to kiss the hem of Ja'far's robe now found sudden and urgent reasons to be elsewhere when he entered the room, averting their gazes as if he were carrying a contagious plague rather than the seal of the empire. The air in the palace grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on the back of one's neck stand up, a constant, low-frequency hum of impending violence that vibrated through the marble floors. It was said that during a hunting trip on the plains outside the city, a moment occurred that sealed the fate of the Barmakids in the Book of Destiny, as Ja'far rode ahead, his falcon soaring higher and striking truer than the Caliph's own. Harun watched him not with admiration, but with a look of such profound loathing that the few servants who witnessed it felt their blood turn to ice. It was the look of a man who realizes that a parasite has grown too large for the host, and that the only cure is to cut it out, no matter how much blood must be spilled. The Caliph began to speak in riddles, dropping cryptic verses of poetry about the transient nature of the world and the foolishness of those who build their houses on the sand, verses that were clearly arrows aimed at the heart of his vizier, yet Ja'far, armored in his impenetrable vanity, believed the arrows were meant for others. He continued to host his lavish banquets, but the flavor of the wine had changed, it tasted of ash and copper, and the laughter of the guests rang hollow, frantic and brittle, as if they were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship while the captain remained oblivious to the rising water. The sensory landscape of the palace warped into a nightmare, the scent of musk and jasmine that Ja'far doused himself in no longer smelled like luxury, but like the cloying sweetness of funeral flowers masking the scent of decay. The shadows in the corners of the great hall seemed to lengthen and stretch, reaching out like the fingers of the grave to grasp at the ankles of the Barmakid family. Yahya, the ancient and wise father of the clan, felt the vibration of the coming earthquake. He saw the way the Caliph's face twitched when Ja'far spoke, the way Harun's hand drifted unconsciously to the hilt of his sword, and he begged his son to retreat, to lower his head, to beg for forgiveness for sins of pride that had not yet been spoken aloud. But Ja'far was deaf, his ears stopped with the wax of his own magnificence, unable to hear the thunder rolling in the distance. He mistook the Caliph's brooding silence for submission, thinking he had finally cowed the ruler into accepting his secondary status, never understanding that a silent king is the most dangerous creature on God's earth. The ultimate humiliation came not in a public decree, but in the quiet withdrawal of intimacy. The private doors that had always been open to Ja'far were suddenly barred, the late-night summons ceased, and the vizier found himself standing in the outer corridors, waiting like a common petitioner while the Caliph conferred with men of lesser station. It was a subtle unmaking, a stripping away of influence layer by layer, skin by skin, intended to leave the victim raw and exposed before the final blow was struck. The opulence of the Barmakid palaces, once the envy of the world, now looked like a mausoleum, the silver tiles glinting like the teeth of a skull, and the fountain sounded like the weeping of widows. There was a moment, frozen in the amber of history, where Harun stood on the balcony of his palace, looking out over the Tigris at the lights of Ja'far's estate, which blazed brighter than the stars, and he whispered to the night wind that the Barmakids had taken the morning and left him only the dusk. This was the turning point, the moment the name Al-Khaafidh descended from the celestial spheres to manifest in the heart of the Caliph. The decision was no longer a matter of politics, but of cosmic balance. The height to which Ja'far had risen was an affront to the natural order, a towering obelisk of ego that challenged the sovereignty of the Caliph and, by extension, the will of heaven. The tension stretched taut, a bowstring pulled back to its absolute limit, quivering with the potential energy of death, and the entire city of Baghdad seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the snap. The poet stopped writing odes to Ja'far's generosity and began composing elegies they dared not write down, storing them in their memories for the day the blood would flow. Even the animals seemed to sense the doom. The Caliph's horses were restless in their stables, kicking at the stalls, and the birds in Ja'far's garden ceased their singing, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. It was in this suffocating quiet that the final resolve hardened in Harun's chest, a resolve as cold and heavy as a stone in a deep well. He realized that two suns cannot shine in the same sky, and for one to remain, the other must be extinguished utterly. The psychological torture of those final weeks was exquisite. Harun would smile at Ja'far one moment, a flash of teeth that looked like a snarl, and ignore him the next, driving the vizier to the brink of madness with mixed signals, keeping him off balance, forcing him to dance on a floor that was crumbling beneath his feet. Ja'far's confidence began to crack, hairline fractures appearing in the porcelain mask of his composure, as he finally started to feel the eyes of the abaser upon him, watching, waiting, judging. He walked through the corridors of power like a ghost, haunting the scenes of his former glory, while the real power shifted into the hands of the executioner, who sat in the dark, sharpening his blade, the sound of the whetstone against the steel, the only honest sound left in a city of lies. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the tragedy demanded its climax. The fall would not be a stumble, but a plunge from the stratosphere, a terrifying descent that would leave nothing but a crater where a god once stood. The narrative of their lives had run out of pages, and the ink was about to be replaced with blood, for when Al-Khaafidh decides to lower a man, he does not merely bring him to his knees. He grinds him into the dust until even the memory of his height is erased from the earth. The final night of the month of Safar in the year 803 descended upon the city of peace like a shroud of heavy velvet, suffocating the stars and leaving the moon to hang as a pale, sickly crescent over the Tigris, a singular watching eye that had seen empires rise and crumble into dust 1,000 times before. It was a Saturday, a day that would be etched into the annals of history in letters of coagulated blood, marking the moment when the wheel of fortune, which had spun so dizzyingly high for the Barmakids, finally snapped off its axle and crashed into the abyss. The air within the royal precinct was stagnant, devoid of the usual nocturnal breeze that carried the scent of blooming jasmine from the gardens. Instead, the atmosphere was thick with a metallic tang, an olfactory premonition of the violence that was coiling in the shadows like a viper preparing to strike. Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the shadow of God on earth, lay awake in his private chambers, his eyes wide and burning with a fever that was not of the body but of the soul, a cold, calculating madness that had finally solidified into a diamond-hard resolve. He could hear the beating of his own heart, a rhythmic war drum pounding against his ribs, counting down the seconds of existence left for the man who had once been his soul's twin. The love he had borne for Ja'far had not merely faded, it had curdled, transformed by the alchemy of jealousy and paranoia into a hatred so pure and so potent that it required a blood sacrifice to be sated. Harun summoned Masrur, the executioner, a man mountain carved from midnight and muscle, whose loyalty was as unyielding as the steel of his scimitar. Masrur entered the chamber not as a servant, but as the manifestation of the Caliph's dark will, his presence swallowing the light of the flickering oil lamps, his breath steady and slow, the breath of a man for whom killing was as natural as drawing water from a well. The command was given in a whisper, a sound more terrifying than a scream, for it lacked all emotion, stripped of anger or sorrow, leaving only the cold, hard bone of necessity. Bring me the head of Ja'far al-Barmaki. There was no hesitation in Masrur, no flicker of doubt, for he was the instrument of Al-Khaafidh, the abaser, and instruments do not question the hand that wields them. He turned and vanished into the labyrinthine corridors of the palace, moving with a silence that belied his immense size, a phantom of death gliding towards the unwitting prey. Meanwhile, in his own opulent quarters, Ja'far lay in a state of restless stupor, the wine of the evening having turned sour in his gut, leaving him with a creeping sense of dread that he could not articulate. He had spent the evening in revelry, as was his custom, surrounded by the sycophants who fed on his crumbs, but the laughter had sounded shrill, and the music discordant, as if the musicians were playing a funeral dirge disguised as a celebration. When the heavy pounding came at his door, it was not the polite knock of a messenger, but the authoritative thud of doom. The door burst open, and there stood Masrur, filling the frame like a blocking stone, his eyes devoid of the deferential twinkle they had held for years. In that single, suspended second, the illusion of Ja'far's invincibility shattered into a million irreparable shards, the silk sheets he clutched felt suddenly like a burial shroud, and the gold-leafed walls of his chamber seemed to close in, transforming from a palace into a tomb. He scrambled to his feet, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, the grace of the Grand Vizier stripped away to reveal the trembling terror of a mortal man facing his end. He stammered, his voice cracking, asking if there was a message from the commander of the faithful, desperately trying to invoke the old familiarity, the shared jokes, the bond that had supposedly been unbreakable. But Masrur did not speak of brotherhood, he spoke only of the order, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Ja'far's chest, informing him that the Caliph awaited, but not for counsel and not for companionship. The walk from Ja'far's quarters to the Caliph's pavilion was a journey through the underworld. Every shadow seemed to hold a demon, and the silence of the palace was deafening, the servants having vanished as if the very stones knew what was coming and had fled in horror. Ja'far, barefoot and clad only in his sleeping tunic, stumbled along behind the executioner, his mind racing through 1,000 desperate schemes, 1,000 pleas, 1,000 bribes, but his tongue felt swollen and useless in his mouth. He remembered the warnings of his father, Yahya, warnings he had laughed off with the arrogance of Icarus, and now the wax was melting, and the sea was rushing up to meet him with terrifying speed. They arrived at the antechamber of the Caliph's private tent, the place where Ja'far had spent countless nights in laughter and ease, but now the entrance was barred by a heavy curtain of red brocade that looked like a waterfall of blood. Ja'far threw himself to the ground, grabbing the hem of Masrur's garment, weeping openly, the dignity of the Barmakids dissolving into a puddle of tears and snot. He begged Masrur to go inside, to check if the Caliph was perhaps drunk, to see if this was merely a cruel jest, a test of loyalty, anything but the finality of death. He offered Masrur mountains of gold, promising to make him rich beyond the dreams of avarice, but the executioner looked down at him with eyes of stone. Yet, even a heart of stone can be eroded by the sheer pitifulness of a fallen giant, and Masrur, leaving Ja'far under the guard of his silent lieutenants, stepped through the curtain. Inside, the Caliph sat on his prayer rug, not in a drunken stupor, but in a state of terrifying sobriety, a copy of the Quran open before him, his finger tracing the verses of judgment. When Masrur reported that Ja'far was outside, weeping and claiming the order was a mistake of wine, Harun did not look up, he merely hissed that if Masrur did not return with the head of the traitor within the count of 10 breaths, Masrur's own head would join Ja'far's on the floor. The executioner recoiled as if struck, the sheer venom in the Caliph's voice banishing any lingering hesitation. He returned to the antechamber, where Ja'far looked up with a spark of pathetic hope, a hope that was extinguished the moment he saw the look on Masrur's face. There were no words left to be spoken, no poetry to be recited, only the brutal, mechanical reality of the slaughter. Masrur did not offer him the dignity of a clean-standing execution, he kicked the legs out from under the man who had once ruled the empire, forcing him down onto the rough leather sheet that had been spread to catch the royal blood. Ja'far struggled, his hands clawing at the executioner's boots, gasping the name of God, the name of the Prophet, the name of Harun, a chaotic litany of despair, but Masrur was a professional. He grabbed the vizier by his hair that had been perfumed with musk and combed with tortoise shell only hours before, and yanked his head back, exposing the throat that had swallowed the finest wines of the East. The sword did not sing, it bit. The sound was a wet, sickening crunch as steel met cartilage and bone, a sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the small, confined space. It was not a single, clean stroke of legend, but a hacking, a butchery, a visceral dismantling of the human form that required force and leverage. Ja'far al-Barmaki, the golden vizier, the man who had thought himself untouchable, died not with a profound last word, but with a gurgling choke, drowning in his own vital fluids, his eyes wide with the ultimate, horrifying realization of Al-Khaafidh. The abaser had brought him low indeed, forcing his face into the dirt, stripping him of his soul before tearing the head from his shoulders. When the deed was done, the silence rushed back into the room, louder than before, broken only by the heavy breathing of the executioner and the drip, drip, drip of blood onto the leather. Masrur stood over the ruin of the man, wiping his blade on the dead man's tunic, a final insult to the silk that had cost more than a peasant's lifetime earnings. He grasped the severed head by its hair, the face frozen in a rictus of terror and confusion, and walked back through the red curtain. He threw the trophy at the feet of the Caliph, the dull thud of the skull against the carpet signaling the end of an era. Harun al-Rashid finally looked up, his eyes meeting the dead stare of his former friend, and in that moment, there was no satisfaction, no joy, only a vast, howling emptiness. He ordered Masrur to strip the body and have it quartered, to verify that the deed was irreversible, to ensure that the Barmakid power was not just killed, but desecrated. The night dragged on, heavy and accursed, as the reality of the act began to seep into the foundations of the palace. The servants who scrubbed the blood from the antechamber floor worked in terrified silence, knowing they were washing away the history of the last 2 decades. The smell of copper lingered, overpowering the incense, a stench that would hang over the reign of Harun al-Rashid until his own dying day. Outside, the Tigris flowed on, indifferent and black, carrying the secrets of the city to the sea, while the wind picked up, howling through the courtyards like the spirits of the damned, mourning the fall of the magnificent, foolish man who had forgotten that in the court of kings, the distance between the throne and the block is measured only in the width of a blade. The transformation was complete. The name of Al-Khaafidh had been written in the blood of the favorite, a terrifying testament to the truth that those whom God raises, he can also destroy, and that the higher the pedestal, the more shattered the idol when it finally hits the ground. The sun rose over Baghdad the following morning not as a bringer of hope, but as a harsh, unblinking spotlight illuminating a scene of such grotesque horror that it seemed to sear the very retinas of the city of peace. The dawn did not break with the gentle colors of rose and apricot that the poets of the Barmecide court had so often sung of. Instead, it bled into the sky in streaks of bruised purple and sickly yellow, casting a pallid, jaundice-like light over the Tigris River, which flowed sluggishly, as if thickened by the sins of the night before. The news of the calamity had traveled faster than the wind, carried on the wings of terror from the palace gates to the mud-brick hovels of the furthest suburbs, whispering that the pillar of the world had snapped, that the sky had fallen, that Ja'far al-Barmaki, the shadow of the Caliph, was no more. But words were wind. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid, in his cold and terrible wisdom, knew that for the lesson of Al-Khaafidh to be truly learned, it must be seen, smelled, and felt by every soul who had ever envied the fallen vizier. And so, the citizens of Baghdad, rubbing the sleep from their eyes and stepping out into the cool morning air, were greeted not by the call to prayer, but by a spectacle of abasement so absolute it defied the capacity of the human mind to comprehend. There, upon the central bridge that spanned the great river, the bridge where Ja'far had once ridden in processions that outshone the sun, sat the grisly trophy of the Caliph's wrath. The head of Ja'far al-Barmaki, the most beautiful face in the empire, the face that had launched 1,000 ships of commerce and inspired 10,000 odes, was impaled upon a rough iron spike, raised high for the crows and the kites to inspect. The skin, once luminous and tended with oils of almond and crushed pearls, was now grey and slack, drained of the vitality that had charmed kings and commoners alike. The eyes, those dark, intelligent pools that had held the secrets of the state, were wide and staring, fixed on a point in the middle distance that no living man could see, clouded with the dust of the street and the dull glaze of death. His mouth, which had tasted the finest wines of Shiraz and spoken words that moved armies, hung open in a silent, eternal scream, a rictus of shock that captured the precise moment his soul was ripped from his body. It was a desecration of the highest order, a deliberate dismantling of the idol, intended to show the world that beneath the silk and the jewels, the golden vizier was merely meat, subject to rot and decay like the carcass of a stray dog. But the horror did not end at the central bridge. It was merely the centerpiece of a city-wide theater of cruelty. The Caliph had ordered the body of his former friend to be quartered, hacked apart with the brutal efficiency of a butcher dressing a lamb, and the pieces distributed to the other 3 bridges of Baghdad. On the eastern bridge, a torso hung suspended, the fine linen tunic torn away to reveal the chest that had once swelled with the pride of nations, now a cavern of red ruin where flies began to gather in buzzing, iridescent clouds. On the western bridge, a leg, still clad in a sandal of gilded leather, dangled from a rope, swinging gently in the morning breeze, a macabre pendulum counting down the end of an era. The sheer violence of the display was nauseating. It was an assault on the senses, a visual scream that echoed off the walls of the city. The people of Baghdad gathered in stunned silence, their hands covering their mouths, their eyes wide with a mixture of morbid fascination and primal fear. They had seen executions before, for the sword of justice was never sheathed for long in the Abbasid court, but they had never seen the fall of a titan. To see the man who had been the second most powerful being on earth reduced to scattered offal was to stare into the abyss of human fragility. It was the manifestation of the divine named the Abaser in its most literal, terrifying form. Ja'far was not just lowered, he was scattered, fragmented, his physical form dismantled just as his legacy was about to be. While the physical remains of Ja'far rotted in the sun, a different kind of slaughter was taking place within the marble halls of the Barmecide palaces. The order had gone out from the Caliph to arrest every member of the family, to seize every coin, every jewel, every scrap of paper that bore their seal. The soldiers of the Imperial Guard, men who had once saluted Yahya and Fadl with trembling respect, now smashed down the intricately carved teak doors of their estates with battering rams, their boots muddying the pristine mosaics of the courtyards. Yahya al-Barmaki, the patriarch, the wise old man who had served the Abbasid throne with a loyalty that bordered on worship, was dragged from his prayer rug, his white beard trembling not with fear, but with the sorrow of a father who knows he has outlived his own name. He offered no resistance, for he had seen the storm clouds gathering long before his sons had, and he walked into the custody of the guards with the quiet dignity of a man who accepts that the wheel of fortune has turned its final revolution. His other son, Fadl, the foster brother of the Caliph, a man of piety and administrative genius, was pulled from his bed, his protests silenced by the flat of a sword, his hands bound with rough hemp that bit into the soft flesh of his wrists. The looting of the Barmakid estates was a frenzy of greed and destruction, a feeding frenzy where the accumulated wealth of decades was devoured in a matter of hours. The soldiers tore tapestries of silk and gold thread from the walls, ripping them to pieces in their haste to find hidden safes behind the plaster. They smashed vases of porcelain brought from the distant lands of China, shattering centuries of artistry in a mindless quest for coins. The fountains that had flowed with rosewater were smashed, the pipes dug up and melted down for their lead. The great library of Yahya, a repository of knowledge that rivaled the house of wisdom itself, was ransacked, the scrolls thrown onto the floor and trampled underfoot, the ink of scholars mixing with the mud of the soldiers' boots. It was a cultural lobotomy, a frantic erasure of the sophistication and grace that the Barmakids had brought to the court. The air in the palaces, once sweet with incense and the sound of lutes, now smelled of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the acrid smoke of destruction. The women of the harem, creatures of beauty who had lived their lives behind veils of gossamer, were herded out into the streets like cattle, their jewels ripped from their necks and ears, their weeping drowned out by the coarse laughter of the looters. It was a total, systemic collapse, a liquidation of a dynasty that had seemed as permanent as the stars. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid watched the dismantling of his former life from the high balcony of his palace, his face a mask of granite. He did not weep, he had shed his tears in the darkness of the night, and now there was only the cold, hard vacuum where his heart used to be. He issued a decree that struck terror into the hearts of the poets and the scribes. No man was to speak the name of the Barmakids, no poet was to compose an elegy for their fall, and no beggar was to ask for alms in their memory. To mention them was to invite the sword. It was a damnatio memoriae, an attempt to scour their existence from the collective memory of the empire. But the silence that descended on the city was louder than any lament, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket of repression that made the air hard to breathe. The people walked with their heads down, afraid to look at the bridges where the meat of the vizier was turning black in the heat, afraid to look at the empty palaces that stood like hollowed-out skulls along the riverbank. They realized, with a chill that went deeper than the bone, that if Ja'far, with all his gold and all his armies and all his charm, could be unmade so completely, then they were nothing more than dust motes dancing in a sunbeam, waiting to be extinguished by the whim of a capricious god. As the days turned into weeks, the horror on the bridges underwent a slow, gruesome transformation. The birds of prey had done their work, stripping the flesh from the bone until the head of Ja'far was little more than a grinning skull, a memento mori that leered down at the passing boats. The stench of decay that had initially sickened the city eventually faded, replaced by the dry, dusty smell of old bones. But the Caliph refused to have them removed. He let them hang there, through the blistering heat of the summer and the biting winds of the winter, a permanent fixture of the Baghdad skyline. He wanted the image burned into the soul of every courtier, every general, every son who dared to dream of power. He wanted them to see the workings of Al-Khaafidh every time they crossed the river. The Barmakids, who had once been the symbol of generosity, were now the symbol of ultimate ruin. Their name, which had been a synonym for abundance, became a byword for catastrophe. To be Barmakid entered the lexicon of the streets not as a compliment, but as a curse, a description of someone who climbs too high and falls too far. In the dungeons of the Raqqa palace, where the surviving members of the family were eventually transferred, the suffering was of a quieter, more psychological variety. Yahya and Fadl were kept in narrow, dark cells, deprived of the light of the sun and the company of men. They were not tortured with hot irons or the rack, for their torture was the memory of what they had lost. They sat in the damp darkness, listening to the dripping of water and the scuttling of rats, remembering the feel of silk against their skin, the taste of spiced lamb, the sound of the Caliph's laughter. They were ghosts haunting their own living bodies, stripped of their agency, their dignity, and their future. Yahya, the old lion, withered away, his strength evaporating like water in the desert, his mind turning over and over the events that had led to this abyss, wondering where the first misstep had been, where the first seed of pride had been planted. He died in that darkness, alone and unmourned, his body buried in a shallow grave within the prison walls, without a stone to mark the resting place of the man who had once held the empire in his palm. Fadl lingered on, a broken man, writing letters to the Caliph that were never read, begging for mercy that would never come, until he too succumbed to the slow poison of despair. The sheer scale of the confiscation was staggering, millions upon millions of dinars flowed back into the Caliph's treasury, filling the vaults to bursting. But it was blood money, cursed and cold. The gold coins that had once been tossed freely to the poor by Ja'far's hand now sat in stagnant piles, heavy with the weight of betrayal. The economy of the city, which had been fueled by the Barmakid spending, shuddered and slowed. The artisans who had crafted the silver lamps, the weavers who had spun the gold thread, the poets who had sold their verses for pearls, they all felt the pinch of the abaser's hand. The golden age lost its luster, the shine rubbed off to reveal the iron reality underneath. The court of Harun al-Rashid became a somber, paranoid place, where men watched their words and their shadows, where trust was a commodity too expensive to afford. The joy had gone out of the world, extinguished along with the lamps in Ja'far's palace. The Caliph ruled on, his power absolute, his authority unquestioned, but he ruled over a graveyard of his own making, a king of ashes and bone. And yet, in the quiet corners of the tea houses, in the hushed whispers of the market, the story began to take on a life of its own. The people, though terrified, could not forget the brilliance of the Barmakids. They remembered the aqueducts they had built, the hospitals they had funded, the sheer style with which they had lived. The brutality of their fall only served to mythologize them, to turn them into tragic heroes in the great drama of history. The skull on the bridge was no longer just a warning, it was a relic, a dark saint of hubris. The name Al-Khaafidh was on every lip, not just as a theological concept, but as a tangible force that walked the streets of Baghdad. They understood now that the universe seeks balance, that for every mountain that rises, a valley must be carved, and that the Barmakids had simply borrowed too much height from the heavens, and the debt had been called in with catastrophic interest. The physical destruction was total, the humiliation absolute, but in that destruction, a strange kind of immortality was forged, the immortality of the cautionary tale, the story that fathers tell their sons when the fires burn low and the wind howls outside, warning them that the higher you fly, the more the gods yearn to clip your wings. The abasement was the final act of their drama, a tragedy written in flesh and blood, reminding the world that in the face of the divine, all kings are beggars, and all palaces are but dust waiting to return to the wind. In the years that followed the Great Purging, the wind that swept through the streets of Baghdad seemed to carry a different weight, a hollow, mournful resonance that whispered through the arches of the victorious and the graves of the defeated alike. The physical eradication of the Barmakids was complete, their bodies were dust, their heads were bleached bone, and their vast treasures had been swallowed into the insatiable maw of the royal treasury, yet their absence was a presence more powerful than any army they had ever commanded. The city of peace had lost its golden sheen, that intangible luster of sophistication and ease that had made it the envy of the world, replaced by a grey, utilitarian grimness that settled over the capital like a shroud. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the man who had ordered the sun to set, found that he was now condemned to live in the twilight he had created. He sat upon his throne of emeralds and teak, surrounded by a court that was terrified into sycophancy, a court where honest counsel had died along with Ja'far. The men who remained were yes men, trembling creatures who nodded at his every whim, afraid to speak a hard truth lest their necks meet the same fate as the vizier's. Harun, a man of fierce intellect and boundless energy, found himself isolated in a prison of his own making, surrounded by reflections of his own paranoia. He had cut off his right hand to spite his vanity, and now he found he could not wield the sword of state with the same dexterity. The administrative genius of the Barmakids, which had kept the gears of the empire oiled and silent, was gone, and the machinery of governance began to grind and screech. Rebellions flared in the distant provinces like wildfires in a dry season, in Khorasan, in Africa, in the very heartlands of the realm, and Harun found himself riding out again and again to stamp them out, an aging lion chasing jackals, weary and bitter, missing the steady hand that used to hold the reins while he slept. The haunting of Harun al-Rashid was not a matter of specters or chains rattling in the night, but a haunting of memory and regret that was far more corrosive. There is a story told by the chroniclers, perhaps apocryphal but dripping with the emotional truth of the era, that illustrates the depth of the void left behind. It is said that some years after the tragedy, the Caliph was inspecting a list of requests for infrastructure repairs, canals that had silted up, bridges that had crumbled, hospitals that had run out of medicine. He turned to his new vizier, a man of little imagination and less competence, and asked why these matters had been neglected. The vizier, trembling, replied that there were no funds, that the oversight required was too great. Harun stared at the parchment, his mind flashing back to the days when a mere nod to Ja'far would have seen mountains moved and rivers redirected, and he slammed his fist onto the table, a sound of pure frustration. He realized then, with a sinking heart, that he had destroyed the architects of his own golden age. He began to see the ghost of Ja'far in everything. When a musician played a sour note, he remembered Ja'far's perfect ear. When a poet recited a clumsy verse, he remembered Ja'far's eloquence. When the treasury reports showed a deficit despite the confiscations, he remembered Ja'far's financial wizardry. The name he had forbidden anyone to speak screamed at him from the silence of his own palace. He became a man possessed by a melancholic restlessness, unable to find comfort in his harem or his wine, for the one soul who had truly understood him, the one soul who had been his mirror, was rotting in the earth by his own command. The love he had borne for Ja'far, which had twisted into hatred, now twisted back into a grotesque, agonizing grief, a phantom limb pain that never ceased. He was the undisputed master of the world, yet he was the loneliest man in creation, ruling over a kingdom of dust and shadows. The manifestation of Al-Khaafidh was not finished with the mere death of the Barmakids. The divine name required a total balancing of the scales, and that included the fate of the executioner himself. Harun al-Rashid, the once vibrant hero of the 1001 Nights, began to physically deteriorate. The vitality that had allowed him to lead armies into Byzantium faded, his eyes lost their fire, and his skin took on the pallor of old parchment. He was plagued by nightmares that robbed him of sleep, dreams where he walked through endless corridors of bone, pursued by a silence that was louder than thunder. In the year 809, whilst on a military campaign in Tus to crush yet another rebellion in the east, a rebellion that the Barmakids would likely have solved with diplomacy and coin, the Caliph fell gravely ill. He lay in a tent on the cold, hard ground of Khorasan, far from the perfumed gardens of Baghdad, far from the Tigris, far from the home he had built. As the fever burned through him, stripping away the layers of his royalty until he was just a shivering, frightened man, he reportedly asked his physician to bring him a handful of the local soil. When he held the red earth of Tus in his hand, he wept, recognizing the soil of his own grave, a prophecy he had heard long ago. There was no Ja'far to comfort him, no Fadl to advise him, only the cold inevitability of the abaser. He looked at his hands, the hands that had ordered the death of his brother in soul, and saw that they were empty. All the power, all the glory, all the fear he had inspired had amounted to this, a lonely death in a foreign field, haunted by the memory of the friends he had murdered. He died not as the glorious conqueror, but as a broken man, crushed under the weight of his own absolute power. The legacy of this tragedy rippled out through the centuries, becoming a dark fable woven into the DNA of the Islamic world. The fall of the Barmakids became the ultimate cautionary tale for every vizier, every minister, every favorite who would ever walk the corridors of power. It taught them that proximity to the sun burns, that the favor of kings is a double-edged sword, and that the higher the ascent, the more catastrophic the descent. But more than that, it served as a terrifying reminder of the attribute of God as Al-Khaafidh. The story emphasized that no human station is permanent, that the glittering facade of worldly success is as fragile as a spider's web in a gale. The Barmakids had believed they were the authors of their own destiny, that their wealth and intellect insulated them from the vagaries of fate, but they had forgotten that they were merely characters in a script written by a higher power. Their palaces crumbled into ruins, their silver tiles were stolen, their names were scrubbed from the monuments, but their story survived. It survived not in stone, but in the whisper of the wind, in the lines of tragic poetry, in the shudder of the soul when one contemplates the abyss. The ruins of their estates in Baghdad became a place of pilgrimage for the melancholic, a memento mori where philosophers would sit and contemplate the transience of the world. They would look at the broken arches and the dry fountains and recite the verses that spoke of the Barmakids, as though they had never sat in the council, nor called for the water of the morning draught, nor passed the night in the joy of conversation. In the end, the silence that reclaimed the Barmakid palaces was the only true victor. The noise of their parties, the music of their lutes, the scratching of their pens, it was all swallowed by the great, indifferent silence of time. The abaser had done his work with surgical precision. He had taken the highest peak and made it a valley, he had taken the brightest star and extinguished it. The story of Ja'far and Harun serves as a mirror for all time, reflecting the eternal truth that pride is the harbinger of destruction, and that in the grand calculus of the divine, the king and the beggar are one and the same, separated only by the thickness of a shroud. The narrative closes not with a bang, but with the quiet, persistent shifting of sands over a grave, covering the gold, covering the blood, until nothing remains but the name of the one who remains when all else perishes. The lesson is etched into the history of the night: fear the height, for the fall is the only certainty, and when Al-Khaafidh decides to lower you, there is no hand on earth or in heaven, save his, that can catch you.